Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
When your own daughter looks you in the eye and tells a room full of people that you don't deserve to be there, something inside you doesn't break, it hardens, like glass that's been through too many fires to shatter again. The moment it happened, I remember the sound before the words. The clinking of forks against plates, the scraping of chairs, the polite laughter that fills any family dinner when people are pretending to like each other. It was Madison's graduation dinner, and she was radiant in that way only a 22-year-old can be: proud, untested, full of self-written wisdom. I had chosen a seat at the end of the table, the kind of position that lets you smile without being noticed. The restaurant was one of those upscale suburban places where the waiters pretend they care about your life story, where every meal feels rehearsed. I had come quietly, bought the reservation weeks in advance, even ordered the cake that now sat waiting in the kitchen with her name in white icing. When she stood to speak, I felt that pinch of maternal pride I used to get when she was little and would recite poems at school. Her voice had that same quiver of performance. She started with the usual pleasantries, thanking the professors, her friends, her boyfriend who had helped her push through hard times. People clapped, glasses were raised, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe this night would be a soft landing after all those jagged years between us. But then she looked at me directly, her tone shifting just slightly enough that my stomach tightened before my mind caught up. "I want to thank everyone who was there for me," she said, her eyes sweeping past me like I was another piece of decor. "The people who believed in me when others were too busy, chasing careers, or their own pride." There was laughter, awkward, scattered, the kind people use when they sense cruelty but aren't sure if it's intentional. My sister looked down. My ex-husband cleared his throat. Madison went on, her voice steady, too steady. "Some people think money can replace love. That paying for things counts as parenting. But you can't buy presents. You can't buy being there." I felt every eye on me. I didn't blink. There's an art to staying still when someone is twisting the knife. You have to become a surface too smooth for it to stick. She kept talking, her words tumbling out like she had practiced them in front of a mirror, maybe even rehearsed the pauses. "So tonight," she said, "I just want to thank those who actually showed up in my life." Then she smiled, and it wasn't kind. Because not everyone at this table deserves to celebrate my success. The silence that followed was long enough to grow old in. I could hear a waiter cough somewhere behind me, the hum of the air conditioner, the click of someone's phone camera stopping mid-recording. My throat was dry, but I didn't touch my drink. I simply smiled, small, polite, a fraction of a smirk that said everything words couldn't. And then I clapped. 3 slow, deliberate claps that cut through the air sharper than any reply I could have given. Her face faltered for half a second, and that was enough. People started whispering. My ex-husband tried to move the conversation forward, raising his glass, mumbling something about family and forgiveness, but the room had already curdled. Madison sat down, cheeks flushed, pretending not to notice the tension she had just carved into the night. I didn't speak again through dessert. I listened to the stories, the forced laughter, the scraping of chairs when it was over. I hugged no one, took no photos. When Madison leaned over to say a quick, tight, "Thanks for coming," I only nodded. She thought she had won something that night: respect, power, maybe closure. What she didn't understand was that some wars are decided not by who shouts loudest, but by who walks away first. At home, the silence felt like medicine. I poured a glass of wine, sat by the kitchen counter, and looked at the small stack of bank statements I had printed earlier that day. The account I'd kept open for her, the one that quietly paid her rent, tuition, and every convenience she never questioned, sat in black and white before me. Years of sacrifice reduced to numbers, all tied to the trust fund her father thought was his idea. He had always loved playing the generous one while I carried the weight in the background. I logged in, fingers trembling only slightly, and moved everything into a new account. I left one small note in the transfer description box: earn it. No message, no explanation, just that. I closed my laptop and felt the air in the room change, heavy with something final. It wasn't revenge. It was relief, the kind that comes when you realize you've finally stopped trying to fix something that doesn't want to be repaired. By morning, her college account was closed. Her card would stop working by noon. The messages would start pouring in before sunset. I would read them all and answer none. The silence had begun, and this time, it wasn't weakness. It was a sentence, one that only time would translate for her. The morning after the dinner unfolded like a stage after the lights go down and the audience leaves, quiet and messy and honest in a way that crowds never allow. And as sunlight crept across the kitchen tiles, I found myself studying the old paper scars of a life that never made it into Madison's speeches, the photocopied custody orders with their gray stamps and wavering signatures, the overtime slips from winters when the electric bill and her braces and the rent rose together like a tide that refused to listen, the letters from bursars written in that friendly institutional tone that says we are a building and you are a person, and while you bleed we will remain polite, and beneath that stacks at the documents that mattered most. The ones no one knew about because I preferred the work to the applause, a slim binder that held the trust agreement I opened the summer before her freshman year under a plain name that meant nothing to anyone, a shell that allowed tuition and housing and meal plans to flow without logos or drama or the kind of leverage that invites control, and I traced the ridged edge of the plastic sleeve the way you trace the outline of a bruise to see if it still hurts. Realizing that I could remember the smell of the bank lobby the day I signed more clearly than the taste of the celebratory dinner I bought myself afterward, because anonymity turns sacrifice into a private religion, and I had been dutiful without letting myself be worshipped. The first text arrived at 9, bright and sloppy, her shorthand as sharp as her voice had been the night before, accusing me of pettiness and cruelty and a level of theatricality that almost made me laugh. Because if I wanted scenes, I would have delivered one under the restaurant's flickering pendant lights while the cake sweated in the kitchen, and while I read the message, I watched the auto-pay indicators on my banking dashboard flip to gray one by one, tuition suspended, housing guarantee withdrawn, bookstore line of credit terminated with the kind of elegant finality banks are so good at, and I told myself I was not cutting a daughter off so much as I was freeing a young woman from a story that had calcified into entitlement. Even as a second and a third message came, each more indignant than the last, full of the language of betrayal learned from people who promise unconditional love in one breath and then hand you a price list with the next. By noon her calls began arriving in waves, and because I knew silence can harden into cruelty if you are not careful, I let myself listen to the first one ring out on speaker, just to take the measure of my own resolve. Hearing the tremor at the edge of her anger, the scramble of a person who has mistaken the floor for scenery and is shocked to learn it is load-bearing, and although a softer woman might have picked up then, might have offered a lecture polished by years of swallowing hurt, I did what I had promised myself I would do if the moment ever came, which was nothing at all, and in that nothingness I felt something close to mercy because for once I was refusing to perform the role she had cast me in, the endless absorber, the constant underwriter of bad behavior and worse gratitude. The practicalities followed, unromantic as plumbing, but just as necessary, a call to the bursar in which I identified myself as the grant administrator formerly known in their system as a neutral trust and, after the required verification steps that I passed because I had built this architecture to protect the investment not the ego, I requested a financial hold until the student presented independent proof of resources for the coming term. And if the woman on the line judged me I could not hear it through the courteous cadence, only the tapping of keys and the confirmation that a notice would be posted to the student portal by end of day. And then an email to the landlord that withdrew my guarantor status effective at the end of the month per the clause I had negotiated back, when hope was a more reckless thing, followed by a carbon copy to Madison's father, who had always relished playing benefactor in public while I did arithmetic in private, a message that said, in the plainest language I could manage, that since he was so fond of speeches about presents, he could now be present for security deposits, late fees, and the affectionate chaos of young adult budgeting. While I drafted those lines, I drifted across the years the way you walk an old neighborhood after a long absence. Passing the night I stitched the hem of a choir dress by hand because the tailor had closed early. The morning I faked a smile for a school award ceremony scheduled at the precise hour my boss demanded I be on a call, the summer I taught her to drive in an empty stadium lot while her father sent videos from beach bars. And I let myself be angry without shrinking from it because anger is not always a wildfire. Sometimes it is a controlled burn that clears the brush and lets newer growth take root. And as I pressed send, I felt that strange bleak freedom you feel when a doctor tells you the wound needs air, that the bandage has become the problem. The afternoon brought screen grabs from friends who prefer storms to weather, threads of group chats with my name used as a hinge between jokes and pity, and I learned, with a steadiness I did not expect from myself, that I could be misquoted without being misled. That I did not need to rush in and fix a narrative that had never belonged to me in the first place, because there is a lesson that only emptiness can teach, and sometimes a mother's job is to step back far enough that the lesson can find its student, even if the student prefers applause to instruction, and even if the teacher prefers saving to silence. By early evening, the calls thinned into angry fragments and then into nothing, the quiet in the house deepening until I could hear the low mechanical breath of the refrigerator and the occasional traffic hiss from the avenue. And I stood at the sink with the window cracked, the kind of posture that looks like waiting but is actually choosing, and I performed the smallest piece of theater I allowed myself all day, which was to fold a square of paper, write 2 words that had once felt like a rebuke and now felt like a map, and tape it to the inside of the front door where I alone could see it. A reminder that if she came I would not explain, because explanation had become a currency she spent too easily. And I wanted to offer value instead of volume. My revenge, if that word can sit next to love without turning the air poisonous, arrived in the click of a checkbox I had been circling for months without admitting it. A clean administrative act that moved the monthly scholarship disbursement I had been routing to her into a fund for students in her department who had lost family support due to illness. A redirection that turned her public cruelty into food stipends and book vouchers for strangers whose names I would never know, which felt as sharp and satisfying as any cutting remark I could have delivered over steak and speeches. And when I closed the laptop, I realized I had finally chosen what kind of mother I would be from this day forward. Not an audience and not a purse, but a door that requires a hand on the handle and a willingness to turn. Night had barely settled when the knock came, the quick-fisted rhythm of someone who believes ownership of your time comes free with the title child, and I stood there, steady as the hinge behind the wood, watching the paper on my side quiver slightly with each impact. 2 words facing me like a pact I had signed with my own spine, and as her voice cut through the panel with all the fury of youth unacquainted with consequence, I let the house remain silent long enough to taste the shape of tomorrow, and then reached for the lock without yet deciding whether I would turn it, because sometimes the real decision is not whether to answer, but whether the person on the other side has arrived ready to hear. She pounded the wood with the righteous tempo of someone who had never been told that a boundary is not a puzzle to be solved, but a wall to be respected. Shouting my name with that clipped impatience she inherited from a father who always believed volume could substitute for evidence, and while the evening air pressed through the small crack in the window over the sink with the smell of rain and asphalt, I stood close enough to feel the reverberation of each knock tilt the paper I had taped on my side of the door, 2 modest words that in the quiet looked almost ceremonial, and I let the sound travel through me the way you let a train pass under a bridge you are standing on, bracing until the last car rattles by and the steel stops shivering. She accused me of playing games, of choosing humiliation in some petty bid for control, of being the kind of mother who hides behind policies and passwords, and her voice kept pitching upward into that thin register where outrage tries to disguise fear, because young pride forgets that hunger is a tutor and rent is a chaperone, and the world remains very interested in teaching lessons no one asked to learn. I spoke her name once through the door, not loud, not pleading, just enough to let her know there was a living person on the other side and not a plot device, and then I listened to the silence that followed. The ice crackle of that first second when a performer realizes the audience will not clap on cue, and in that pause I measured what I was willing to say that I could live with later. Because anger tempts you to spend words like lottery winnings and regret sends you the bill with interest. And when I finally did speak, I used the same calm voice I had learned in emergency rooms and parent-teacher conferences and all the other arenas where dignity is a rope you grip with your teeth. telling her that one day she would be grateful that I refused to compete for her allegiance, that I would not stand in a doorway and audition for the part of the good mother while she played the casting director of my worth. That money was not loyalty and access was not love, and that if she wanted an answer tonight, she was getting the only one that mattered. I slid the folded square under the threshold with a slow push that felt ceremonial, the paper catching once on the metal plate as if the house itself wanted to keep it, and I pictured her bending to pick it up. The shadow of her hair falling across the mat I had bought when she was a child and still thought welcome signs were magical, and while she read those 2 words that had been following me around all day like a spare heartbeat, I could almost hear the instant she understood they were not a threat but an invitation, because the wall I had built was not designed to punish, it was meant to make an opening somewhere else. One that required effort and attention and a willingness to stand in a life without a safety net woven by a woman she delighted in dismissing. She called me heartless then, and I let the words slide past as if the grain of the door had grown slick with rain, reminding myself that love without refusal becomes indulgence, and indulgence without limits becomes contempt. And while she rattled the handle as though stubborn metal could be coaxed by indignation, I thought of all the other doors I had opened for her without applause. The late-night drive to a 24-hour pharmacy when the fever would not break, the principal's office, where I asked for grace after a mistake she never admitted to, the bank manager's glass cubicle where I convinced a stranger to see my daughter as a story worth backing. And I realized that the hardest door I would ever hold shut was the one that protected her from the cheap victory of winning a speech while losing herself. When the knocking slowed to that sullen rhythm that announces the end of improvisation, she tried a different script, the softer menace of loyalty threatened, promising to go to her father and tell him everything, swearing he would take me to court and make me pay for whatever it was I thought I had taken from her, and I felt the familiar ache of that word court pass through me like a low-pressure system, because I had stood under that sky before, and I knew what storms he could conjure and which ones were just noise on the horizon, and without raising my voice I told her that parents who build their power on secrets eventually find themselves paying interest with their dignity, that the truth always finds its way out of sealed envelopes and closed mouths, and that if she wanted to stand beside him she was welcome to do it with her eyes open. My small revenge for the night, the kind that looks like nothing from the sidewalk, was already arranged and did not require any theater, a 1-page certified notice that I had mailed that afternoon to her father's office, not with threats or dramatic revelations, but with a bland, competent paragraph informing him that the trust he had paraded as his generosity had been dissolved according to the terms he signed, that all future requests would require direct documentation of need from the student, and that his history of accessing discretionary disbursements for celebratory necessities had been archived for review, a sentence so dry it could soak up a spill, which I knew would sting far worse than an argument, because men who love appearances cannot bear the mirror of paperwork. Eventually the knocking stopped altogether, replaced by the quiet rustle of a body defeated by a close thing, and I stood there long enough to hear her footsteps retreat down the porch steps and across the walkway where chalk lines from a neighbor's child still ghosted the concrete, and then, because I am not made of stone even when stone would be easier, I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door to the rain-washed night, the porch empty except for the note she had unfolded and then left, face up on the mat as if to return the responsibility to me, those 2 words staring back at me like a dare, and I picked the page up and pressed it flat against the jamb until it dried, reminding myself that resolve is a muscle and muscles do not grow smoother when you stop using them. Days slid into weeks the way a curtain slides along a track, ordinary in motion and inevitable in effect, messages thinning and then vanishing, rumors about me circulating like seasonal colds. And I remained unresponsive not because I enjoyed the austerity, but because I could feel a new structure assembling inside my quiet, a room where I could breathe without negotiating my oxygen. And just when I had begun to believe the house would keep its equilibrium indefinitely, the past broke its seal. Because on a late afternoon flooded with the syrupy light that makes everything in the kitchen look like memory, the mail slot snapped and a thick envelope hit the floor with the weight of a small confession. My ex-husband's handwriting angled across the surface in the same impatient slant he used to sign birthday cards, and as I turned it over in my hands, feeling the ridges of something more than paper inside, I understood that the story I had refused to perform was going to drag its paperwork onto my stage whether I invited it or not. The envelope lay on the kitchen tile like an animal that had wandered in from another season, heavy and deliberate, its corners blunted with the kind of authority that knows it will be opened eventually. And as I slit the flap with the back of a butter knife, I felt the odd steadiness that comes when the thing you feared has finally grown bored of hiding, because whatever waited inside had the dense patience of facts printed on bank letterhead and the thin, brittle energy of a man who always preferred performance to proof yet had been forced to deal in documents after all. Inside, clipped with bureaucratic precision, were monthly statements from the trust whose quiet pulse had carried Madison through the last years. Copies of withdrawal requests decorated with the kind of euphemistic phrasing men use when they are dressing appetite as obligation, notations for celebratory support and social necessities and advancement activities, each one stamped with the routing through his office. Each one signed in a hurry that tried to look like leadership and landed instead on appetite, and stapled to the back as if to keep it from wandering into daylight was a letter from the bank's compliance officer, firm and dry, explaining that an external audit had flagged a discrepancy between the designated beneficiary's educational disbursements and the guardian's discretionary reimbursements. Language so politely lethal it took a full breath to translate into the blunt version that lived beneath it, which was that he had been siphoning off the thing he bragged about funding. I stood at the sink with those pages in my hands and watched the thin stream of water stitch itself into the drain, thinking of all the nights he had sent Madison messages about how mothers who choose ambition over presence could never understand what real support looks like, how he had opened tabs at restaurants that serve praise on wooden boards while I was moving money between accounts at a tiny desk that rocked if you leaned on it, how he had strolled through campus tours as if tuition were minted under his shoes while the transfers arrived from a trust named for a woman who did not exist, because sometimes the safest way to serve is to disappear, and I realized that the insult of the dinner speech was not the worst of it, because humiliation can be rinsed from the skin, but the theft of credit hardens in the bone. He had included a note written in that charming register that once made me a witness for the defense of his character, insisting he had slipped the statements under my door so we could present a unified front when the bank reached out, promising that he had meant well, that some of those celebratory purchases had included gifts for Madison and therefore were, in spirit, aligned with the purpose of the fund. And he asked me to call him, not to apologize but to coordinate, because a scandal would harm our daughter more than our pride. And while I admired the economy of that argument, I also recognized it as the adult version of the tactic our child had used over staken speeches, which was to convert consequence into sentiment until the room forgets to ask for receipts. I did not call him. Instead, I called the compliance officer whose signature sat beneath a paragraph I trusted more than any memory, and I offered to provide the documentation that would close the loop. The original attorney letter that confirmed my role as the contributing grantor, the schedule of transfers that originated from my wages and not his bonuses, the email thread that proved the trust had been structured specifically to keep our names out of the classroom gossip while keeping our child inside her classes, and I spoke with the measured respect of someone who has learned that institutions require tone as much as evidence, hearing in the woman's professional pauses a kind of sympathy that never once bled into pity. And when we hung up, I forwarded copies to the address that serves as the bank's conscience, then sat very still and decided what kind of revenge would leave the least ash in my mouth. The choice arrived almost fully formed, like a room I had designed in a dream and then found waiting for me when I woke, because if silence was my voice now, then I would use its volume, and if absence was my weapon, then I would use its shape. So I drafted a short, legally tidy instruction to dissolve what remained of the trust upon reconciliation and to route the closing balance, minus the reconciled misuse, into a scholarship fund under a name that would never map back to ours, a pilot program administered by the department where Madison studies that would offer small, unglamorous grants to students who had lost parental support not to death or divorce, but to drama, which is its own kind of orphaning and rarely appears in brochures. And I funded the inaugural round with an additional deposit equal to the amount he had siphoned disguised as celebration, because nothing rebukes theft like a receipt that turns loss into relief for someone you will never meet. The paperwork, dry and elegant, did what speeches cannot. It changed reality without asking anyone to applaud, and as I signed the last page, I felt a clear, clean satisfaction that outlived anger and did not require an audience. I did, however, leave a single breadcrumb where I knew it would be found without spectacle: an anonymous donation receipt folded inside a diner check presenter at the small campus cafe where students go to mourn grades and practice futures, addressed in a hand no one would recognize to the departmental office that keeps track of favors, with a short note that said that kindness should be boring and that support is loudest when no one can hear it, and though I did not sign it, I placed, almost absently, a napkin beneath the slip with the same 2 words that had been haunting the edges of every choice I had made since the night of the toast, because a message turns into a path when it stops pointing outward and starts facing the person who wrote it. That evening, while the sky bruised itself into twilight, a friend sent me a photo without commentary, a grainy snapshot of Madison at the very diner where I had left my unremarkable envelope, hair pulled back, apron crooked, smile smaller but real in a way that had never survived the glare of celebrations, and though I wanted to read into that expression a conversion narrative, I pressed the temptation flat like a crease and chose patience instead. Right up until my phone buzzed with a new message from an unfamiliar academic address that asked, in restrained institutional prose, whether I could come in the morning to discuss the audit and the ownership of a certain silent generosity. A meeting that would require me to step into the same building where my daughter studies to become the woman she already believes she is, and as I stared at the time and place stamped in that invitation, I felt the story change keys, the way a song you thought you knew tilts into something darker and richer. Because the truth I had carried for years was about to enter a room where truth is graded, and whether I liked it or not, there would be witnesses. The morning I walked into the small campus diner felt almost like entering the echo of a life I had once imagined and then quietly buried, the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and syrup. The hum of conversation soft enough to make every clink of ceramic sound like punctuation in a sentence I hadn't realized I was still writing. Madison stood behind the counter in a faded uniform that belonged more to endurance than style, her hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that only exhaustion teaches, and for the first time in years she looked neither curated nor defensive. Simply human in the unguarded way of those who have finally stopped performing for love. I sat in a corner booth by the window where the light came in slanted and kind, the kind that forgives wrinkles and memories, and ordered black coffee I had no intention of drinking. She didn't notice me at first. She was busy balancing plates, greeting customers with that polite brightness people learn when life has humbled them enough to see value in small exchanges. Watching her move, I thought of all the lectures I had rehearsed, but never delivered, all the tidy explanations that now felt as absurd as trying to summarize weather in a single word, and I realized that silence had done what words never could. It had pruned her arrogance into something alive. When she finally looked up and saw me, her body froze in a posture halfway between recognition and disbelief, a flicker of something raw and unguarded in her eyes before instinct pulled the mask of composure back into place. She approached slowly, wiping her hands on her apron like a person preparing for an apology they aren't sure will be accepted, and when she spoke, her voice carried that hesitant tremor of someone who has learned that pride does not pay rent. "You shouldn't be here," she said, but it came out softer than she meant, as if the words themselves doubted their authority. I smiled, not out of victory but something quieter, the kind of peace that comes after realizing you don't owe anyone understanding for the choices that saved you. I told her I was just passing through, that the coffee smelled good, that I hoped she was doing all right. She nodded, eyes darting down as if searching for a script that no longer existed, and the silence between us stretched wide enough to contain every version of the past, the birthday she spent at her father's, the late-night calls I answered from parking lots, the dinner that shattered whatever we pretended was still intact. When the check came, I placed the bills under the saucer and slipped the envelope on top, plain, white, unremarkable, with her name written in the same cursive I used when labeling her school lunches all those years ago. Inside was the note I had carried folded in my purse for weeks, waiting for the right moment that might never arrive. The same two words that had guided every choice I made since the night she told me I didn't deserve to be in her story. I didn't wait for her to open it. I just stood, adjusted my coat, and told her to take care of herself, letting my voice carry no more emotion than a weather report. Outside, the wind was sharp but not cruel, and I walked slowly toward the parking lot, resisting the urge to look back, because some moments only stay pure if you leave them unconfirmed. Behind me, I could almost hear the faint rustle of paper being unfolded, the pause that follows realization, and maybe a sound that could have been a quiet sob or a deep exhale, though by then I had already reached the street. The note, I knew, said just one word this time: earned. Not as a challenge, not as punishment, but as recognition that she had crossed the line from expectation into understanding, that she had built something without me holding the safety net beneath her. In my car, I sat for a long moment before turning the key, letting the engine idle while my thoughts stretched across the years, tracing the strange geography of motherhood, the territories of sacrifice, resentment, and love that overlap until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. I thought about the scholarship fund, about the students who would never know the story behind the money that kept them afloat, and I imagined her one day discovering that the program existed in her name, realizing the symmetry of a lesson finally completed. It wasn't forgiveness I wanted, it was equilibrium, a quiet understanding that everything we break, we also build, if we wait long enough and keep our hands steady. That evening, the house felt different when I returned, not lighter exactly but realigned, as if the walls had adjusted to a new temperature of peace. The phone, which had so often been a battlefield of unspoken expectations, remained silent, and I didn't check it. I cooked for one, washed the dishes slowly, and left the back door open long enough to hear the rain start, that steady percussion that feels like time itself exhaling. For years I had spoken through effort, through payments, through interventions, through desperate attempts to earn gratitude that was never mine to claim, and now I understood that the only language left worth speaking was absence. Somewhere, in a small apartment she now paid for herself, my daughter was learning that silence can be both punishment and protection, both wound and cure, and that sometimes the people who step away are not abandoning you, but allowing you to finally meet yourself without their shadow in the frame. I do not know when we will speak again, and the truth is, it no longer feels like waiting. There is a grace in distance, in knowing that love does not always look like closeness, and that peace does not need witnesses to exist. Every mother, I think, reaches a day when she stops trying to be understood and begins instead to understand the quiet. That day came for me not at the dinner table, not at the door, not even in the diner, but in the stillness that followed it all, the realization that the story I had been trying to finish was never mine alone. Somewhere out there, she is rewriting hers, and maybe that is the only ending worth believing in, the kind that leaves the room half-lit, the dialogue unfinished, and the silence still teaching.